So maybe that's a useful start. Hi, I'm Jen Silvers. I am a professor at UCLA in the psychology department. I conduct developmental neuroscience research. So I'm particularly interested in how the brain develops across childhood, adolescence, and in young adulthood, and how this brain development supports emotional development. A lot of my research is focused on how our social ties to others impact brain development. So a lot of my research is on people who examines what the consequences are of people experiencing adversity early in life. So for example, I have a long-term study examining the consequences of folks experiencing orphanage care early in childhood. I've also worked with folks who were adopted from foster care. And in addition to that, we have a couple of lines of research looking at how relationships with one's friends, relationships with parents, how those different kinds of relationships impact our well-being in everyday life, and also might impact brain development, how the brain works. I study how people regulate their emotions, decision-making, learning. That's the very quick summary. I had the pleasure of visiting Nueva back in October, I guess it was, for your Innovations in Learning conference that was held there. And so that's how I got connected to you all. And I am happy to talk about research I do. I'm happy to talk to you also about sort of what careers look like in science or different paths in psychology, how I got here to the job I have today. Just talk about my kids. They show me that I don't know anything about development as much as I think I do, at least. So whatever is of interest to y'all. And like I said, I do have slides for a more formal talk if you just want to kind of chill and listen to someone gab for a while, that's fine too.
Yeah, all of it sounds so interesting. Do you want to like maybe take a vote, like, or if anyone's particularly
that's what I was gonna say, take a poll.
Yeah. Okay. So it sounds like who wants to like hear a structured kind of presentation with slides? And then who wants to hear kind of like just have more like a Q&A format? Okay, I think slides it is, but maybe we could do like a little like question and answer at the end.
Yeah, and you can interrupt me anytime. It's fine. I will just talk as if I was at the conference I basically gave this talk at before with I changed like 2 slides. I don't even know if I have the right date on it. Yeah. Okay, let me see if I can share my slides. And now. And is that sharing my whole screen?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, let me change the 1 second, let me stop this. Let me. How's that look? You're good? You're seeing a part of it?
Mhm.
You promise?
Yes.
Yeah.
Not making me look like a clown? Okay. So the title of this presentation is The Role of Experience in Adolescent Brain Development. And I'll explain a little bit more about what I mean about experience as I go along. Just to start, as I alluded to, I'm also happy to not talk about my research more formally, but to tell you more about how I got to where I am today. So as I mentioned, I'm a professor at UCLA. Before that, though, I grew up on the East Coast. I grew up in Bethesda, Maryland, located right outside of Washington, D.C. I went to college at the University of Virginia. That's where I first got exposure to doing psychology research. And although I took a lot of neuroscience coursework while I was there, there weren't opportunities for doing brain imaging at UCLA, at UVA at that time. And I thought that's probably what I wanted to do, was to do brain imaging research in humans. I did some neuroscience coursework in animals, and I got sick of cutting off rat heads and decided that I really wanted to do something in humans. And so my undergrad advisor basically connected me with the one person he knew who did brain imaging work in humans. And they worked at the national. Sorry, are you good?
Sorry.
Oh, no, okay, that's fine.
You should be fine.
I'm
now.
sorry. Is the audit, you're okay? Okay.
No.
And if you do have just a question and want to interrupt, that's fine at any time. Just, I just want to make sure that it was that and not weird feedback. So I spent 2 years working at National Institutes of Health, between undergrad and then applying to graduate school. And then I went on to complete my PhD, at Columbia University in New York, and hung out in Columbia for 3 years after my PhD doing postdoctoral research in a different lab. And I came to UCLA in 2016. So along the way, a lot of luck, a lot of asking for help, and I'm happy to pay that forward. So really, any questions you have about pursuing careers in science or about other sort of alternative paths taken, please let me know. I wanted to put this up here just to note that I'm the one presenting today, but as a professor, there's no way to do the work I do without working with a lot of people. I'm just listing here the people in my lab who contributed to some of the research that I'm going to tell you about. I'm not even listing my other faculty collaborators, but every project I work on has at least one other faculty member who helped in some way with it, or it was some sort of union of our ideas. And then also at the bottom, some of the funding sources that enabled this research to happen. And then also just mention another major source of knowledge in my life for developmental science are my kids, who are 1, 4, and 6. They're absolutely bananas. Like they're a lot of fun, but they are like, we have a babysitter who's an actual parenting coach. Like that's her job, is to tell people how to parent. And every time she like leaves, she's just like, that was an intense experience. And I'm like, I know, that's how it is every day of my life. Me just running around yelling at them to wear pants while I try to say that I know something about parenting. But they've taught me a whole awful lot. So I'll just say that about them. So hold on one second, I just lost my mouse, and it would be helpful because I would like to minimize the picture of me that's like taking up half my screen there. So I'm a developmental psychologist and neuroscientist, I said, and what brought me to this work is really the fact that I'm obsessed with change and the concept of change and the fact that people can change and that we all do change across our lifetimes. You know, we know that each person is different from each other person. There's a lot of uniqueness to us, and there's some things that stay the same, but there's a whole lot that changes as we grow up. And I've just always thought that was a really cool thing. I didn't begin my research career doing work in looking at children and adolescents. I initially worked with adults, but I think it was really that feature of change and the fact that by focusing on development, you get to see how people get built rather than just seeing the final product that I found to be so interesting. So my lab has followed up on something that's been clear to developmental scientists for a long time, which is that a lot of what drives change in people is our experiences. So where you grow up, do you grow up in a neighborhood that's safe or not? Do you grow up with parents that you can trust or not? Do you have good friends? Do you have access to a school that's going to challenge you? What are your siblings like? All of these experiences are a huge factor in what drives brain development. And my lab is particularly interested in social experiences. So for example, how we interact with our caregivers early in life. When I say caregivers, that's like a fancy word for parents and other people who act like parents to us. We're also really interested in how peers at later points in development might help to shape our brains. So I'm going to talk about a few lines of research in my lab that we've conducted looking at how experiences shape brain and behavior. So I'll talk first about early adversity, something that we know is a particularly potent kind of experience that can shape brain and behavior. I'll talk about a new line of research doing some really wacky stuff to look at something that we're calling neural specialization as a form of brain development. And then finally, I'll talk about friendship as a kind of experience we have that we think might intervene to change the trajectory of our sort of emotional development. So our earliest social experiences, particularly if they're adverse or negative in nature, can have outsized and surprisingly long-lasting effects. So for example, we see that early adversity, experiences like abuse, neglect, receiving institutional care, They explain up to about a third of adult mental illness. So we're not just talking about them having an impact in childhood, but really across the lifespan. What's tricky is that these kinds of experiences impact a lot of things. And so it can be really tricky to figure out what specific links exist between experiencing adversity and then having some kind of mental health challenge down the road. So one way that my lab has been trying to unpack the way that early adversity might impact our emotional health is by thinking about the different stages that occur when we have an emotional experience. So let's say that you're walking down a dark alley, and suddenly someone jumps out at you and pulls out a knife. All right, kind of an intense situation, right? There's a lot of features to this. It's not like you just immediately know what's going on. First, you have to use your senses to detect that there's a potentially really scary thing happening. Then you have to sort of make that assessment of the situation. So you heard something, you saw something, now you have to interpret it like, oh shit, this is bad. What am I going to do about it? And then from there, you have a variety of options for how you're going to respond. And this is kind of a framework that we've been using in my lab to try to make sense of how early adversity can impact the way that we have emotional experiences, is by thinking about how it impacts our sensory experiences around emotion, how it impacts the way we think about emotional events, and then how we choose to regulate them or to respond to them. So the first way we've looked at this is by focusing on the way in which individuals, basically the way in which they sense the environment. There's a lot of research that's been done looking at sensory processing, or how we perceive and respond to to sounds, touch, sights, smells, etc. There's a lot of research on just how that works at a very basic level in neuroscience that's been going on for a long time. And more recently, in the last few years, there's been a lot more appreciation about how this plays into development, with a lot of focus on autism in particular, is one common sort of form of neurodiversity that's characterized by differences in sensory processing. However, there's growing appreciation that it's not just individuals who are on the spectrum who might have differences in sensory processing, but there might be other features too that can impact the way in which we perceive sensory information. So to test more formally, to learn more about this, I had a graduate student named Adriana Mendez-Leal who was really interested in whether early adversity, experiences with orphanage care or foster care, might impact sensory symptoms. We collaborated with another professor here at UCLA, Shula Green, and looked at these two groups of young people, so ranging in age from 8 to 17 years, half of whom had experienced foster care and half of whom had been in orphanage care, and looked at their sensory, at how they reported, whether or not they reported having sensory difficulties in everyday life. So specifically, we wanted to see whether individuals who had experiences with adversity were more likely to have really strong negative reactions to certain sensory experiences. So, for example, finding it really upsetting to hear a vacuum cleaner on, hearing a hairdryer blowing, the feeling of a tag on your t-shirt. These are all sensory experiences. And for a lot of people, these just are no big deal. And for other people, they can be really distracting and distressing. We found that people who had experienced foster care or orphanage care were a lot more likely to find these experiences to be distressing. And what was really interesting is that if they experienced these sensory symptoms, they were a lot more likely to have psychological symptoms. So specifically higher rates of things like depression and anxiety, suggesting that sensory symptoms might be one way in which experiences of early adversity might contribute to emotional challenges in people who've experienced adversity. So, and really, feel free to just tell me if you have any questions about something at any time, because I'm gonna just talk about a bunch of different topics. But any questions or anything you want to add about or ask about or talk about with regards to sensory symptoms before I dive into something totally different? You're good? All right. I'll talk about so as I was mentioning before, if someone jumps out at you in an alley, you have to sort of sense and perceive what's going on. You might also then have to understand what's happening or decide whether this is something safe or something scary that's happening. We've also been looking at how early adversity can shape that process. So one way we've done this is by looking at young adults who differ in terms of whether or not they experienced adversity, either abuse or neglect, early in childhood. And here we've been looking specifically at how their brains process information that's either a good, how their brains process cues in the environment that look to be good, bad, or kind of ambiguous. One way we can do this is by just seeing how people respond to a really simple stimulus. That's facial expressions. So, if you look at this face, I don't know, can you see my mouse?
We can.
Yeah.
Okay, if you look at that face all the way on the right, does that look like someone who's having a good time or a bad time?
Good.
Good, right? This seems like unambiguously, that is a happy face. So we would, and now on the other hand, if you look at someone over here on the left, what does that look like?
Surprise.
How do they look to you?
Surprise,
Surprise, bad.
scared.
So that's so that is this is where it gets a little tricky. That is a surprised facial expression, which people vary a lot in how they interpret. If you show the same surprised face to a group of 20 people, each person will be pretty confident about what they're seeing, but some people interpret surprise in much more positive ways and some people in much more negative ways. And it turns out that that actually predicts a lot about their anxiety symptoms, about how they perceive the world. So we've been using surprise faces to allow us to kind of probe how the brain interprets situations that are ambiguous, that can be interpreted in a variety of ways. So specifically what we've been doing, what we did in the study was to look at using a technique in functional magnetic resonance imaging called representational similarity analysis. We can basically get a pattern across various brain regions of looking at patterns of brain activity and see how much that pattern looks the same for a given person when they're looking at faces that are happy, when they're angry, which I'm not showing you here, and also when they're looking at faces that are surprised. And what we wanted to see is how much do the angry faces, which is something that's clearly bad, overlap with surprise versus how much do the happy faces overlap with surprise. And then see how much being exposed to abuse or neglect changes the degree of overlap. Does that make sense? I'll go through in a little more detail in the next bit. So specifically what we've found across a bunch of different brain regions that are responsive to different kinds of emotional stimuli, including brain regions involved in processing reward, salient and threatening events, and also just brain regions that are responsible for encoding value in the environment. What we see is that for individuals who are exposed to abuse and neglect, they show a higher degree of overlap in terms of how their brain processes threatening information and ambiguous information, suggesting that early adverse experiences tune the brain to see things as ambiguous in a way that's more consistent with how they see threatening information. So you can imagine this makes a lot of sense, right? If you're growing up in an environment that's unsafe, you can't really rely on the adults to keep you safe because they have allowed you to be exposed to abuse or neglect. Your brain is not stupid. It responds to that by trying to keep you safe by not taking any risks. It interprets information potentially that could be good or bad. It's more likely to assume it's bad and not take a chance on it maybe being good. It's kind of a way of it's almost the brain's way of saying better safe than sorry. So when it makes individuals' brains more likely to interpret things that are ambiguous in potentially threatening ways. So that tells you a little bit about how early adversity impacts sensory information, how we process sensory cues, how we make sense of emotional events in the environment. I'll tell you about one last study looking at early adversity that we've conducted, where we were working here with youth who were adopted from orphanage care. They were adopted at very young ages, typically around 1 or 2. How many people here have memories from when they were 1 or 2? You don't. That's a trick question. You can't have them because there's something called infantile amnesia. We sometimes think we do, but we don't. They're reconstructed based on reminders from the environment. So people don't typically have memories from when they were 1 or 2, but still our very early experiences from that time can still shape our brains and bodies. And we wanted to examine what the consequences are for that in terms of what the implications are of those early adverse experiences on mental health. And then also whether differences in how people regulate their emotions or how they manage strong negative emotions might explain some of these differences in mental health. So we looked at two different kinds of emotion regulation strategies. We asked people to just report on how often they use them in everyday life. And then we also looked at their depression and anxiety symptoms. Consistent with what's been seen in other studies, we found that people who were in orphanage care were more likely to report higher symptoms of depression and anxiety. However, this was partially explained by, this was at least in part explained by the fact that they were more likely to use a strategy called expressive suppression. So expressive suppression, have you ever felt bad about something, but not shown people how you were feeling?
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
a little bit.
Yeah.
We're a very communicative group. So everyone's like, no, never. Most people have at some point, and it's normal to do that sometimes. But if that's your only strategy, it can catch up with you over time. And there's a lot of research, particularly in Western samples in the United States, especially. It's not as clearly problematic in certain other, when data have been collected in other countries, particularly in Asia, but because it's a little bit more consistent with some cultural norms around emotional expression. But among Americans, especially, this tends to be using this strategy too much can be associated with poor mental health outcomes. And what we saw in this study is that basically among people who experienced early adversity, part of why it seems as though they're experiencing worse mental health symptoms is because they're using this strategy a lot more than folks who were not exposed to early adversity. I know that I think I talked a little bit more at the beginning, so I didn't than I intended to before kind of going into slides. I know we were kind of debating which slides to use. So we're running up on time. I'm happy to just switch to just straight up Q&A, or I can tell you if you would rather about like one other study. I'm thinking if we were going to talk about one other thing, it might be, you might enjoy learning about the friendship study that we've been doing or some of that research. But I'm happy also just to talk with you all if you have any, if you want to just talk more in a Q&A format.
I think the friendship one is fine.
Okay, I will skip ahead. If you care about neural specialization, you and me are like 2 out of the 4 people who do, but I think it's cool stuff. We used tools from economics to look at how the brain specializes to get better at regulating emotion with age. But it's a little bit more niche. So what I'll say about friendship, we've been really interested in this last few years, in particularly how friendships matter in adolescence and young adulthood. Because as you all may have experienced, people's social worlds change a lot during adolescence. Friends become particularly important for emotional well-being during this time. And in science, there's a lot of ways in which this is often studied that gives friendship a bad rap. So scientists are pretty, I'd say people who study, especially adolescents, are often really focused on the negative features of friends. So thinking about things like peer pressure and how friends might encourage each other to take unsafe risks. But there's also a lot of upside to friendships. They can matter a lot for promoting good mental health. You can learn a lot from your friends. And it might be sort of an opportunity in adolescence and young adulthood, to think about friends as a way of improving mental health. So one way we've thought about this in the last few years is by adapting an experimental test that that many people have used for decades, looking at how people can regulate their emotions effectively by themselves and bringing friends into it. So in this traditional paradigm, what we do is we have people think about an upsetting event and then try to think about it differently. So they might reinterpret that something like seeing this picture here, it might be a little small for you to see, but it's somebody looking very sick in a bed and somebody next to them, sort of sitting next to them. So you could look at this and think like, oh my God, that's horrible. Someone's dying. Or you could think to yourself, I'm sure that they are still being able, it's a positive thing that they're able to connect right now, even though their loved one has been hurt. Maybe there's something positive still happening here. That's called reappraisal, where we reinterpret a negative event and think about it differently. what we've been doing in the context of friendship is seeing what happens when you don't just try to reinterpret or reframe a negative event by yourself, but when your friend helps you with this. So for example, you might hear your friend's voice telling you while looking at this upsetting picture, I'm sure that person will recover from the accident, or something like what I said. I'm sure they're still able to enjoy this time together. What we've been finding, what we predicted is that this kind of social emotion regulation might be more effective than when we try to regulate our emotions by ourselves. And what we found is that this does seem to be the case. So these bar graphs just show how bad people feel, with larger numbers meaning that they're feeling worse. In gray, you're seeing how bad people feel when they're doing this task by themselves. In black, you're seeing when their friend is helping them. So the main thing to pay attention to is the two bars in the middle, that people report feeling less bad when their friend helps them with regulating their emotion than when their emotions when they try to do it by themselves. So we first found this in a group of young adults. We've since shown that what's really interesting is even when your friend is not there with you, if they ever helped you, you keep feeling better about the pictures that they helped you to regulate your response to. So a day later, people continue to show this same pattern of feeling better about the images that their friend helped them to regulate their emotional response to. And I won't show the slide, I don't have a slide here to show these data, but two things we're doing right now to try to understand this better is, one, we're collecting these data in teens. Two is we're collecting these data again inside the MRI scanner to understand what is happening in the brain that's different when your friends help you versus when you do it alone. And the third thing is a kind of wild experiment we've been doing where we found one of the things that predicts whose friends are most helpful. Do you want to take a guess? What makes a friend particularly helpful?
Closeness, emotional.
We thought closeness would matter. It does a little bit. It's something that's nothing to do with their relationship. It's something they do with their voice.
Like
I'll tell you. Sorry, what?
Like reaffirmations or something. Like
We thought that might matter too. And we have another experiment which seems like that sort of validating or affirming someone's feelings matters. What's really weird is having a high-pitched voice seems to help a lot. I could never have predicted this. But there's actually some science behind it that even like within friendships, like within these friendship pairs that we see come in, the trials where their friend uses a more high-pitched voice, people feel better than they on the trials where that same friend uses a lower pitched voice. And then also when we compare between the friendship pairs, the ones where what the friend is has a higher pitched voice, that those friends tend to feel better on average. I don't make this up, it's science. Who knows why? But there's apparently some prior research that suggests this is consistent in other contexts too. So I skipped a bunch of stuff, but just wanted to give you a little bit of a flavor for some of the stuff that I do with my lab, showing how early experiences shape our sensory experiences, the way we interpret the world, and the way we regulate emotion. I skipped over the neural specialization part, but hopefully I was also able to show you a little bit about how friendships might be one way that we can improve emotional health and well-being. And I can tell you, maybe tell you next time about what we find when we finish collecting data on that particular experiment in adolescents. But for that, I'll just say thanks, and I'm happy to answer any questions.